This video is all about biological molecules. In order to build molecules, we need to start with something smaller, however, and that is called an element. So some of the elements that are important in biology are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And you've had a little exposure to these already. So we've talked about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. We talked about oxygen and hydrogen being involved in some of those cycles. But next in this video, what we're going to talk about is some molecules that can be made out of these elements that are used by the cells and by living organisms in order to function on an everyday level. So if we've got some elements, we can think of elements, maybe each one as a different color dot. And those elements can then be combined into compounds. So if I want to make a compound out of some carbons and some oxygen and some hydrogens, I would have lots of elements and I would connect them with bonds. So this is what we call a compound, many elements together. And compounds can be biological molecules. And what we can use these molecules for is building bigger things. So if I take this little compound here, and I consider that my building block, I can use that building block and bond a bunch of those together to make something even bigger. And that is really where our biological molecules come in. So the molecules we're going to be talking about are huge molecules. They're just not a simple compound, but they usually have thousands of separate atoms or separate little dots in them. Now these building blocks and big chains of building blocks do have names. So the building block itself is called a polymer. Oops, sorry, not a polymer. Back up. The building block itself is called a monomer. Mono meaning one. Okay, so this is a monomer. So it's a compound that's used as a building block. Each one of these guys is a monomer. So when you join many monomers together, you get what's called a polymer. Poly for many. And again, these polymers that we're going to talk about are the biological molecules that we're interested in. The first of the polymers, or the biological molecules, is the carbohydrates. So what we want to think about first for the carbohydrate is what is the building block. The building block, or the monomer for carbohydrates, is called a monosaccharide. And an example of a monosaccharide is glucose. This is a monosaccharide you built in class using the marshmallows. So if one of these little guys is a glucose molecule, then we have 5 monomers up here. Remember the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. So there are many atoms of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in this one monomer. Now, if we take a bunch of those glucoses and we bond them together, and we're talking about thousands of glucoses, bonded together to make a larger molecule, that is our polymer. And the name of a carbohydrate polymer is a polysaccharide, and that makes sense. Poly means many. And there are 4 different examples of polysaccharides that I would like you to know. The first 2 are found in plants, so we'll make those green. So starch is an example of a polysaccharide, and cellulose is an example of a polysaccharide. Starch is what plants use to store energy, and cellulose is what plants use for structure. Now, animals also need to store energy and to build stuff, so they have different different polymers that they use to do that. So I'll do this in yellow. So to store energy, animals are going to use a polymer called glycogen. So we all have glycogen in our liver, which is the storage of glucose reserves. So when we need energy, We go to our glycogen reserves in our liver and get the energy from there. A molecule that's used for structure in animals is called chitin. Now, chitin isn't in humans, but it's found in any animal with an exoskeleton, like an insect or a lobster or a shrimp. And again, it's used for structure. It's used for building that particular organism. The second type of biological molecule we're going to look at is called a lipid. You may have heard of this as a fat. The monomers for lipids are called fatty acids. And they are just a chain of carbon molecules with some hydrogens on the side. Okay, so they're mostly hydrogen and carbon. They do have some oxygen in them as well, but you built one of these, actually you built a few of these when you were doing the marshmallow model. I'll refer to that again in a minute here. So the monomer for building a fat is a fatty acid. The polymer actually can vary quite a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some examples of some different polymers. The first one is the triglyceride. That's the one you built in class with the marshmallow molecules. And you needed 3, notice the tri in triglyceride, you needed 3 fatty acids in order to build a triglyceride. Triglyceride is for energy storage. This is how we store energy in our bodies, in the form of this type of fat. Energy. That doesn't make any sense. Energy storage. The next type of molecule that's a polymer of fat is called a phospholipid. All right, number 2, phospholipid. And these are found in cell membranes. We will talk a lot about this in the next unit. Other examples of fats are waxes, which are often used for protection. So leaves would have a wax on it to protect them. And then finally, something called steroids. Now, people typically think of anabolic steroids, like the steroids people take illegally to pump up their muscles. But besides hormones, steroids are also things like cholesterol. All right, so we have some examples of polymers, and along with that, we went over the function of many of the lipid polymers. The third type of biological molecule is a protein. Again, we'll start with a monomer. The monomer of a protein is an amino acid. And the polymer is called a polypeptide. Poly again meaning many, so that gives you a clue there. So again, if we put a bunch of amino acids together, we create a thing called a polypeptide. Now the functions of proteins are pretty diverse, and we will go through a lot of these as we cover different units further in this class. But for now, I'm just going to touch on them, and then when we come back to them later, it'll make more sense. So one of the main functions of a protein is to build structures. So your hair is made out of protein, your muscle is made out of protein. Proteins also serve as enzymes, which speed up reactions. They also serve as antibodies, which are part of your immune system. And finally, proteins can be used for transport of different substances in your body. And we will go through, as I said, lots of examples of all of these as we go into more units. The last biological molecule I'm going to cover is the nucleic acid. The monomer of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. The polymer of a nucleic acid, again, we have many examples. So example polymers could be DNA, RNA, and ATP. Hopefully some of these sound familiar. So let's do the functions. So DNA and RNA are for information storage. So this is what stores all of the information to make you who you are, the instructions for building you. It's found in our DNA and our RNA. ATP should sound familiar. This is our source of energy. Sometimes it's called the energy currency. This is what the body spends when it needs energy. So remember when we talked about cellular respiration, we said that you take oxygen and glucose and you add those together to make carbon dioxide, water, and then the main product, ATP. So that ATP that's made is a type of nucleic acid used for energy.